Children's wants every child to live the healthiest and most fulfilling life possible. That includes making sure children and teens are protected from COVID-19. COVID-19 vaccines are safe and will help protect your child from illness and hospitalization. This isn't about beating the odds, it's about changing them for all kidkind. Get your child vaccinated today.
Welcome. My name is Elaine Sulkin, and I'm the publisher and CEO of ParentMap. We are really thrilled to have put together a consortium of truly the best parenting publications in the country. We have with us today Chicago Parent, Metro Family in Detroit, New York Family, and New Jersey Family. And they are partners with us at ParentMap to bring you the 22-23 Parent Ed Talk Series. It's truly a thrill, and it feels very important to bring to you Khalil Gibran Muhammad and Jeffery Robinson for our talk today on race in America and education. And on behalf of this consortium, it's our collective business and it's our passion to help build an inclusive, safe, educated, and loving community wherever families are. We're laser focused on doing this to better serve you, and we are not satisfied with the status quo. So we hope this will help kick off some energy and action around the society that we would all like to be living in. Before we kick off with Khalil and Jeffery, I'm hoping that you'll just take a moment in the chat and let us know what city you're in. It helps us just have an understanding of the scope of communities that are represented. And we'd also love a quick sentence on what got you to in your most precious time to show up today. While you do that, I'm just going to go over a couple of housekeeping issues. Today's webinar is recorded for educational purposes, and so that all registrants, many thousands we're thrilled to say, can watch this at their leisure. Everyone will receive a recording of this. And again, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the Zoom chat. It's open for Q&A at the end after the presentation and conversation between Khalil and Jeff. So thank you again to our partners, Chicago Parent, Metro Parent, New Jersey Family, and New York Family. A very special thank you to our presenting sponsor, Seattle Children's Hospital, to our platinum event sponsor, the Gates Foundation Discovery Center, as well as our gold sponsors, Dartmoor School, Hyla School, Seattle Country Day School, and Thyra Health. With that, I want to introduce Khalil and Jeffery. So Khalil is the Ford Foundation Professor of History, Race and Public Policy at Harvard Kennedy School, and the Director of the Institutional Anti-Racism and Accountability Project. He's the former director of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, a division of the New York Public Library, and the world's leading library and archive of global Black history. He's the co-host. I highly recommend it. I love it. Podcast, Some of My Best Friends Are, available for free download on Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen to podcasts. Now I'd like to introduce Jeffery Robinson, an old friend and really a motivating scholar and the creator, CEO of the Who We Are Project, writer and co-producer of the Who We Are, A Chronicle of Racism in America, a documentary film based on the groundbreaking presentation that he created on anti-Black racism. Check out just the New York Times review of that, and you will be inspired to watch this amazing piece of work. He has over 4 decades of experience working on criminal and racial justice issues, and most recently as the former legal director of the ACLU. So with that, I turn it over for a conversation with you guys. I'll jump back on for Q&A at 1:50, whatever time zone you're in, and we'll have a hard stop on the hour. So thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Elaine. It's a great to be back at ParentMap and to be here with my good friend and partner, and all things justice oriented, Jeffery Robinson. Jeff, just saying hello to you too. We're not together, but we're here in this virtual space. Uh-oh, Jeff, you're still muted. You're still muted, buddy.
I am saying it's so great to see you, and thank you, Elaine, for having us be here together. I'm really excited.
So, Jeff, I thought we'd get started by telling a little bit of our own origin story. I mean, it may not be obvious that the two of us would care so much about what's happening in people's homes as the predicate for this thing I call justice. And since we sort of flip the coin like they do in the NFL, I'm gonna receive the kickoff first. So, I'm 50 years old. I'm a post-civil rights baby. I came of age in the 1980s. My parents were teenagers during the height of the civil rights movement. And for me, I can tell you that at a very young age, at 5 years old, my mother attempted to enroll me in her workplace. She happened to be a school teacher. She was teaching on the north side of Chicago, which for anyone here from Chicago knows that it's the historically white part of town, still is, although increasingly diverse by populations of Latinx and Asian Americans. But in 1977, when my mother worked at this school called Francis Parker, it was an all-white school, the school of firefighters and police officers, she'd made a deal with the principal to allow this young teacher to bring her child with her to work to attend kindergarten. Now, this was not customary. Neighborhood rules typically determine where you go to school, but the principal agreed because my mother had a long commute to get to the north side. She was part of a massive experiment in the Chicago public school to redistribute Black teachers to white schools. So the teacher said, in the spirit of what we're all trying to accomplish here in 1977, let's do this. I lasted a day, Jeff, one day. And I lasted a day because the teachers immediately identified me as not being a neighborhood kid because my race identified me as different and therefore unworthy of attending the school. They quickly gathered their resources together, went to the administration and said, this kid doesn't belong here. And the principal, looking out for his own skin, said, actually, my mother tells me, they said, correct your mistake. And the principal corrected his mistake. I got kicked out of the school and went to my neighborhood school in the south side of Chicago. Now, it's a good thing that Black folks take care of their own, and I am thriving today. But it's an early lesson in my life about the power of race to determine and to predict life outcomes. In many ways, the resources of that school, the ability to determine who's worthy and who was unworthy, was not the problem necessarily of the children in the classroom. It was the problem of the parents. And that's why we're here today. We're here to talk about what parents bring to these issues and what kids absorb as a consequence of parents' own baggage, their own sense of socialization, their own sense of who we are as a people. And so I'm going to stop there because that's an important origin story for me, but I think you have your own.
Well, I do. And Khalil, it's interesting because I will kind of jump back from 1976 or so, where you were talking about, to 1963. And at 6 years old, my older brother and I integrated a Catholic school in Memphis, Tennessee, where we're the only two Black kids in the entire school. It was 1st through 8th grade, and the first two Black kids that had ever gone there. I think my experience might have been similar to yours, except the pastor of that school had made a very deliberate decision that he wanted my parents to bring us to that school. We lived closer to that Catholic school than to the all-Black Catholic school, which was down by the Mississippi River, and that school was closing. And this priest from Mississippi, I have no idea where he got this notion, but he decided, you live near my district, I want you in my school. And I had the experience of meeting a kid the first day I was on the school grounds. We were both 6 years old, and he is the best natural athlete that I've ever met in my life. He played college football, almost went to the NFL, and his nickname was Opie. because he looked exactly like Ronnie Howard on the Andy of Mayberry show. And because he and I became immediate friends, my role in that school, my slide into that school was a little bit easier. But I knew at 6 years old that I was doing something exceptional. My parents sat me down and said, you're going to an all-white school. There are going to be people there who tell you that you're not smart, that you can't do this, that you can't do that, and you don't listen to them because you're beautiful, you're intelligent. And so that was my first experience with it. And if I jump forward to 2011, when my wife and I, who don't have children, all of a sudden become parents. My wife's sister and her mother were raising our nephew, and they both died within 6 months of each other on the East Coast. And so Matthew, who was a teenager, becoming a teenager in Queens, all of a sudden was becoming a 9th grader in Seattle, Washington. And when he asked me, what happens if the police roll up on me? And I started giving him answers that were the exact same answers my father gave me in the 60s. And when he told me that, my father told me, this is exactly what my father told me in the 30s and in the 40s before I graduated from high school and went to World War II. And that made my stomach turn. Yeah. And that has a lot to do with the work that I've been doing now.
That's such a powerful and revealing story. And I think it really cuts to the heart of so much of what we want to cover today in this conversation. That is that Black and brown children, children who are non-gender conforming, children who are ably challenged, don't have the luxury of not being prepared to be on the short end of bias and bigotry from children and adults, from their own peers. Everyone in this conversation is absolutely crystal clearly aware that children can be mean to each other. And the easiest way to be mean to another child is to identify the person whose difference is apparent, whether it's poverty, whether it's race, whether it's sex, whether it's gender, whether it's speech or language, nationality, you name it, is the easiest way to socialize this notion that that's the odd person out, that's the weak link, and we're all going to prey on this person. And if we're not going to all do it, there's going to be a bully who does it, and the rest of us are going to stand idly by and watch it happen. And that's the problem we need to solve for. That is the problem that if we take it specifically around race, we take the subject of your film about the historical underpinnings of structural racism in this country, we take my work at the Institutional Anti-Racism and Accountability Project, we recognize that race is certainly one of many ways in which children organize themselves without any adult supervision whatsoever, but it is also one of the greatest sources of power. And so if children start organizing themselves around racial difference, and then map that onto the social structures, economic and political structures of our society, both past and present, that is a recipe for total disaster.
Well, Khalil, I think you're right. And the concept that our children are going to be uncomfortable wrestling with this is a real concept. And, you know, parents are always concerned, my God, is my child able to deal with this? But I think you said it, something you said at the beginning is very important. There are children who don't have the luxury of their parents deciding, are you ready to deal with this? Right. I knew that I was different. Somebody asked me, when's the first time you knew that you were Black? And I think my response was, I don't remember a time when I didn't know I was Black and where I didn't know the difference that made. And so part of the concern about what do we teach our children when they're young? How young can we teach them? And that's, of course, a completely legitimate concern, because I'm not going to talk to a 5-year-old the same way I'm going to talk to a 15-year-old. That's ridiculous, and nobody would suggest that. But there is an assumption that your child is not being taught.
Right.
And that is where I think you have done work and others have done work just to demonstrate that is so wrong, because our children are being taught at a very early age about these differences. And some people say as young as 3 or 4 years old, when they can tell the difference between what's fair and what's not. And I know you have thought a lot about this.
Yeah, and you know, just so that you know, we think it's important, you and I in particular, to bring the ideas that come from research down to the surface so that people on this call really have a clear understanding. But I think it's also important to cite some research. So I'm going to mention here a particular study. It's a work written by a scholar named Margaret Hagerman. She's a sociologist, and she wrote a book called White Kids: Growing Up with Privilege in a Racially Divided America. And I'm going to read just a couple of sentences here so that people listening to this conversation understand that this isn't just a sum total of your and my experience or what others may have experienced, but actually researchers are looking at this problem. She writes, "The very few but important studies that have examined aspects of racial socialization within white families illustrate that some white parents do not even think about race when it comes to raising white children, and that white parents do not believe it is necessary to talk to their white children about race." She goes on to say, while some parents of Black children are teaching their kids how to navigate racism to stay alive, some parents of white children are teaching their kids that race no longer matters in the United States. And the truth is that we've lived through, both of us, me slightly later than you, this epic of color blindness, this notion that, oh, we don't see race. But that's totally absurd. Not only is it absurd, psychologists have studied precisely how early infants and young toddlers recognize difference. They recognize color difference, pink and blue. They recognize difference in mommy and daddy's faces. They know who's a stranger and who's not. And they also see racial difference because they'd have to be blind not to. And since most of our children are not born blind, although some are, clearly, we have to recognize that as they begin to be socialized into spaces and there's more white people and the Black people look different and are exceptional, the question is not that they are bigoted or racist. The question is, what are we teaching them about the nature of social inequality that exists in our society? Why are there more Black children? Why are there more Black caregivers pushing white children on the Upper West Side of New York City or in many affluent neighborhoods across the country? That's an oddity for a 4-year-old white child who's used to seeing a white mommy and a white baby. So I'm illustrating that the research that people like Hagerman have done and others really have, this is not an open question. This is a settled fact. Children at very early ages, even as infants and small toddlers, will see difference, Jeff.
And so if children will see difference, I know that there are concepts, people have said, well, you may make my child feel guilty. And one of the things I've thought is that even at 6 years old or 5.5 years old, I understood that when my parents said, who did this? If my brother Herbert did it, I wasn't getting into trouble. And I might feel bad about what was going to happen to Herbert, but it wasn't going to happen to me. And if they came and said, oh, well, Herbert did it, you're going to be punished, that's not fair. And there is this concept of fairness that I have learned, quite frankly, from you and some of the work you've done, that I think is so important here, because children can understand the concept of fairness at a very, very early age. And so when you're beginning to talk to people, to your child about fairness, that is one potential way to introduce discussions about race. And so here again, at a very early age, we're having children talk about it, because some of the social study sort of scholarship that I have read suggests that young children are often saying, you know, if we say something about race, like, oh, look, mommy, that person's really Black. Oh, no, don't say that. Don't say that. And now the kid is trying to process, so what did I do wrong? Are they not Black? Because they look Black to me. That's what you told me the color Black was. And so I'm just describing something, but children learn, oh, okay, there's something about this that I didn't pick up on. I got to be careful here.
That's right. One of the leading psychological researchers, a woman named Beverly Daniel Tatum, wrote a really popular book. It had its 25th anniversary just this past year. Why are all the Black children sitting together? It was a book that looked at dynamics on college campuses in terms of racial socialization amongst young adults. And she has talked explicitly about her own experience raising her own children as inspiration for her research, which is to say that when her child began to ask questions of the school books that they were reading and saying, why are there no pictures of people who look like me? She either could say, this is a part of a society that has normalized whiteness, and we're working on this, baby. Or she could ignore the question and just go and buy the child some books and say, here are reflections of yourself. The point being that most children at very young ages will ask probing questions. They will discern that something's not quite right in terms of the distribution of faces and bodies and places and how they line up in the world. And I'm going to quote another researcher, a researcher out of Texas named Bridget Vittrup, Vittrup. She essentially says that I'm quoting, ignoring children's comments or questions only encourages stereotypes to remain unchanged. In contrast, having open dialogue about race has been associated with lower levels of bias. So this is something that parents have chosen for decades not to talk about, to kind of distract the child. Oh, honey, we don't want to talk about that. What the child learns is not that the issue isn't real, but that we shouldn't talk about it. That's
right. And so they look out in the world and they see with their eyes the gap in every socioeconomic measure between white and Black America, because they see who's around and they see who's not around, and they see who's walking, and they see who's driving, and they see who's standing on the corner looking like they're homeless, and they see who's not. And so they start to make judgments. This is the way the world should look. I guess this is the way it should be. So I think that part of this is parents taking a deep breath and kind of talking about, I don't have to necessarily talk about race to my 3-year-old unless they start asking questions. Like my friend, when her child was 3 years old, would look at me and say, your hair is curly. I had hair then. This is many, many years ago. Your hair is curly. Mine isn't. Right. Why is yours curly and mine isn't? And he wanted to know because he was interested, and not talking to him about, well, you know what? The people that I came from were born in a different place. And look at my skin, it's darker, and he's looking. And so we're now talking about it in a way where he walks away from that conversation saying, kind of cool, he's got different curly hair, but he's still that guy that I really like and that, I have this relationship with. And so small things like that can make such a difference. So I think if you are so right, if we can ask parents to just look at some of these studies and take a deep breath and start just listening to your children and start talking to them about concepts of fairness, this is a way to lead them into what they are going to be learning in school.
So I want to wrap up the part of this conversation that's about young children, because I think we can move forward to more age-appropriate discussions where we really begin to talk about the maldistribution of opportunity and power in our society, the historical factors that contribute to these things. And you and I would both agree those are not appropriate for 3-year-olds or 4 or 5-year-olds. So let me say a few things very explicitly about young children. And I'm going to open to come back to a personal story. I have 3 children. They're currently 22, 20, and 16. In each of the cases of my children when they were growing up, they all had a moment when they had a kind of racial awakening. I'll start with my son. When my son was about 5 years old, he was in kindergarten. He made friends with several kids, but one of his friends was the daughter of one of my colleagues. I was teaching at Indiana University, and as I colloquially say, it was the whitest place I'd ever lived. The population was about 4% Black, and I'm from the South Side of Chicago. All of that's fine, except my child was the only in this classroom. And so somehow he made friends with the Jewish child, a little girl, whose name I won't mention, but let's call her Alice. That's not her real name. He made friends with Alice in this classroom. And one day, Alice's parents were at our home having a meal, and they said, you know, we want to tell you something about what happened in Alice and my son Gibran's classroom. Alice said to us that she identifies more with Black people than she does with white people because one of the white children in class told her she was not invited to their birthday party because Jews killed Christ. So it was a really powerful moment for my son to be exposed to this, and this wasn't even directed at him, it was directed at another child. My daughter, Justice, about 7 years old, was in a classroom, and a child of South Asian ancestry said to her, "You can't play with us, you're too brown." Which also illustrates another complexity, that the way that bias gets distributed is not always white to Black, or Black even to white. Sometimes it's from a person of color to another person of color, because children of color often experience the pressure of fitting into a larger white majority. And then the last example I'll give is that my middle daughter, Jordan, when she was pretty young, we showed her the story of Ruby Bridges, the story of the child integrating the school in New Orleans when she was 6 years old, and whose experience of being escorted into that school by the U.S. Marshals was captured famously in a Norman Rockwell painting. Well, when we showed her Ruby Bridges, we were trying to do kind of what we're talking about. We were trying to model this idea that you present history in age-appropriate ways. And so she watched the story of Ruby Bridges, and it was kid-friendly, except she was so taken with it that she went to school the next day, and she said to her teacher, she said, "Why are you being nice to me? White people don't like Black people." Now, I say this because this is, you know, as we say vernacularly, this is keeping it real. Because for any parent who's tried to open the door and then something like this goes awry, there's often embarrassment and retreat. They back away from it. But what this was yet another opportunity. It was an opportunity for Jordan to understand that actually all white people aren't that way, that there are nice white people, that there are white people in her own life who love her as play aunts and uncles who she's grown up with. So that's an opportunity for us to lean into that work. And that's exactly what we're talking about here. Using the basic concept of fairness to identify explicitly the way that children are already dividing themselves, making sure that race is one of many ways that children will understand how difference manifests in their lives. And to be frank, to use this as an opportunity for children through an explosion of children's books that are happening now that are capable of telling the stories of, say, Harriet Tubman or Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. In other words, the resources today that did not exist in our day are begin to have this conversation at home, and then to encourage age-appropriate curriculum engagement at school.
And I'm so glad that this is a great way to end this conversation. And I just want to say that I saw this thing in the chat that I just want to comment on. Someone that was saying that they had been talking to their child, their toddler, about race and racial differences since they started talking. And like, should I not have? And the answer is, you did exactly the right thing with your child. If your child is having questions and is curious and you're talking to your child, then that's exactly the right thing. And as Khalil just said, if you say something and they take it wrong or there's confusion, then that's another opportunity to say, hey, let's step back and fix that, and then we can go forward. So I want to congratulate you on your willingness to engage with your child that way. I just saw that and I wanted to comment on it.
Yeah, and think about how nonsensical it is, Jeff, when we know for a fact that literacy and numeracy are taught over and over again. It's not like you learn how to add at some point in primary school, and then you're never tested on it ever again. It's the building block to more complex knowledge. And so because this country has been running away from its own past and been running away from the discomfort of dealing with race in the present, we think this is a one shot. It's like a vaccination. You get one shot, no boosters, we're good. And that's not the case. So let's talk about what a booster looks like as children get older. And I want to give you a chance, Jeffrey, to talk about the Who We Are Project, to talk about what is it that this project stands for and why it's so important, because in many ways, the parents are also at a disadvantage because they didn't learn much themselves.
Well, this is, I think, the reason that I sort of veered from the pure practice of law and more into what I'm doing now is having the education that I had at Marquette University, at Harvard Law School, and then discovering in my 50s all of this information I had never heard before. And I discovered it because once Matthew came to live with me, I started looking for help anywhere I could get it about what do I do with this young Black man in my home who's 13 years old and taller than I am. And I was just looking for help. And I didn't find much because I wasn't looking in the right place, I think, but I kept finding this history. And so many people talk about, well, you know, is this theory, is it this, is it that? From what I understand, if you talk about what people did and what they said about what they did, that's history. That's not theory. It's not anything else. And so understanding that history and this, please.
Because I want people to be clear about what you understand, what you're saying. So I know that you in your film take on this question of the causes of the Civil War. So just give the tiny little evidence to illustrate your point about people describing exactly what their motivations are.
Every state that left the Union wrote a secession statement. So you don't have to have a course in 2023 about the causes of the Civil War. And I was at University of Cincinnati Law School yesterday, and 3/4 of a class of maybe 100 kids raised their hand when I asked how many of you were taught that there were reasons other than slavery for the Civil War. And these are people that are in law school right now. I will use the Texas secession statement as just an example. And they make it absolutely clear that slavery was believed by Texans to exist before Texas became a state, and they intended it to exist forever. And it was justified by the revealed will of the Almighty Creator. And so they made it clear, we are leaving because of slavery. Mississippi said, we have a clear choice. Give up $4 billion of property or secede. And we choose to secede. So when you look at the secession statements, they all say it's all about slavery. But our history has taught something different. And I believe it's taught something different because acknowledging that we killed all those people to defend the right to own somebody as property is a really difficult thing. And it also explains why the end of the Civil War didn't just wipe out racism. Because do you think the people that were saying the will of the Almighty Creator is that these Black people should be subservient to us, do you think they stopped believing that just because they lost the war? They didn't.
Of course they didn't.
Well, they didn't. And so we have this unbroken history that explains why America looks like it does today. And that's what I think is so important. Let me just say this quickly. 1837, 25 years before the Civil War, John C. Calhoun, vice president twice, senator from South Carolina, a virulent racist. He writes and says, we have to get abolition out of the pulpits and out of the schools, because that's where the minds of the rising generation are impacted. And if they learn about abolition, slavery is done for. And he was absolutely right. Jump forward to the end of the Trump administration. The last 2 days of that administration, they put out a document called the 1776 report saying we have to go back to patriotic education, meaning the education that kept all of this information from all of us. And Khalil, that's the thing. This information was stolen from all of us. It wasn't just stolen from Black America, from all of us. And we have got to reckon with it in a healthy way to go forward.
Yeah, you know, this is such an important point because now we're really talking about historical literacy. And the beauty of both the Calhoun statement as well as Trump's executive orders banning the teaching of race and racism in federal agencies and what has now become law in about 12 states is that if you did, in fact, want to change America to be more just, to socialize our children to be better human beings and citizens at a young age, you would have to change the history that we tell. You would have to deal with this. And for someone on this call, I mean, I know a lot of people are from Seattle and New York City, Detroit, Chicago, so there are a lot of blue staters here. But if someone is from a red state or a red city, or if someone is also just wanting to know how to have that conversation, would we allow Holocaust denialism in contemporary Germany to be acceptable for a first-class nation in terms of what we expect for people to learn from their own past? And as a consequence of that simple analogy, which is not to belittle the importance of the Holocaust or what happened to Jews, we in this country clearly understand the importance of a never forget. Look at 9/11. I just walked through Newark Airport, where I lived here at the time of the attacks on 9/11, and there was a memorial for this year's anniversary, Never Forget. So how is it possible that we can have clear evidence that we have deliberately been forgetting our own history to do what? That is, to prevent the systemic change that unfortunately did not happen after the end of slavery, and even after the civil rights movement, as Dr. King himself has so eloquently reminded us in his final book, Where Do We Go From Here, we were already backsliding from.
Right.
And so this is work, this is, I can't say this more clearly, and this is why your project is so important, Jeff. This is unfinished business. This is not a new thing. This is an old problem that we've never addressed.
That is maybe the essence of it, is that just to use as an example, the Tulsa Massacre. Many people now have an idea of what that was about. But if you had never heard of it, if you didn't know that it happened, and you went to the Greenwood neighborhood in Tulsa, Oklahoma today, you'd see an economically depressed Black neighborhood. You'd see Black ownership of one building on Greenwood Avenue. That's the Vernon AME Church. And you'd see, it's got some fire damage. I wonder what happened there. And so you would see these highways going through the city. You would not know why it looked that way. And so if you were then going to design policies to fix it, you would design policies that wouldn't work because it wouldn't deal with the fact that that was a thriving neighborhood that got destroyed 35 blocks and 4 square miles, almost $10 million in unpaid insurance claims in 1921 money. So we're talking hundreds of millions in terms of value today, and then highways built through the city literally on top of mass graves. If you understood that that was the reason this neighborhood looked this way, you would take an entirely different approach. So when people wonder why are schools as segregated today as they were in 1954 when Brown versus the Board came out? Why is Black home ownership still so low and it hasn't caught up? There are reasons for this in our history. And if we understand them, we can go forward together. And so people are thinking, where do we get these things? And this is where parents, I think, can truly get involved. All you've got to do, for one thing, is introduce yourself to people on your school board. Because there are people on school boards who are striving for exactly the kind of education that you and I are talking about, Khalil. And there are all kinds of resources that are out there. We'll list some of them on the Who We Are Project website. You can see some of them going to Khalil's organization. But I think it's involvement with your school board to identify what is being taught and how it's being taught. And that, I think, is one of the most radical political acts that people can take right now.
Well, I think this conversation is just important. I'm always psyched when we have it, and I know we're going to be moving to Q&A in just a moment. I want to recap something you said, Jeff, because I think it's really important to put an exclamation point on it. And I also want to introduce a concept here that I think will help clear some things up. So when you talk about the Tulsa example and you talk about the impact on the Black community's economic capacity to send its own children to schools, its capacity to show up in positions of leadership in the public and private sector at a demographic number that is commensurate with our population. For most of our history, particularly across the 20th century, a lot of white Americans have taken our lower status in society, our lower economic position, as evidence of our inferiority, of our incapacity. And so when you actually begin to unpack the history of structural racism, when you begin to unpack the stories of Tulsa or of Rosewood or of Chicago or of the dozens of other cities that have experienced racist attacks on the Black community and the systemic theft of those communities through various predatory practices, whether it was in real estate or in banking, you have a very different understanding of the nature of contemporary racial disparities. It is also true that for every way that we might understand a racial disparity, we should also understand that white people weren't just neutral in this story. They actually were beneficiaries of government redistribution policies. They got free land in the 1862 Homestead Act. They got free education, beginning with the land grant to colleges to set up the agricultural and mechanical schools across the country. Every state has one. And of course, the New Deal and the GI benefit continue to subsidize not only education, but jobs and housing. These are all things that Black people were systematically excluded from, so much so that in your lifetime and in mine have direct effects on our own family.
Absolutely.
To pass on generational wealth. So
absolutely.
About this is theoretical and nothing about it is as abstract. And so critical race theory for everyone on this call is a set of legal ideas that began in the 1980s to help lawyers and legal educators to debate the finer points of how the law helped to make all of this possible, to be complicit in the stories that we've talked about. So when we talk about CRT, that's what it is. But in the broadest sense, this is a conversation about the history of race and racism. And the use of the language of CRT to say that's what they're teaching your kids in school is both misleading and it's true. What we are calling for high school students, for age-appropriate students, is for them to understand the things we've talked about. And while we would never have called it CRT at that level, I'm not going to sit here and die on the sword and say it's not a version of CRT, because it is. But when people like Calhoun and Trump don't want you to learn things like this because they don't want things to change or they want things to remain like they were in the 1950s, then you get the country that you deserve based on the stories that you teach and tell your own children.
And Khalil, thank you for that. And it is so true. And here's a tiny example. From 1934 to 1962, the FHA paid out 98% of its home loans to white Americans.
That's right.
Do you think that had an impact on the ability of Black Americans to buy homes? Of course it did. So the sentence that I just said, this is what the Federal Housing Authority did, and they did it on purpose. Many people are saying you can't teach your children that because, and then fill in the blank. Right. And if we can end, I know we're going to Q&A, but I want to end our CRT discussion with this. In the state of Florida, Ron DeSantis, who passed his anti-woke law, which a federal judge has just ruled is unconstitutional, in the arguments of that on that case, here's what his lawyers said when they were asked, will you define what woke means? And the lawyer for DeSantis said, that means that there are systemic injustices in American society and there is a need to address them. Governor DeSantis does not believe that. And I will read you the first paragraph from the judge's decision throwing out this law. It was a bright, cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. And the powers in charge of Florida's public university system have declared that the state has unfettered authority to muzzle its professors in the name of freedom. And that first sentence, bright cold day in April, clock striking 13, the first sentence from 1984. So this is a reaction where people are understanding, wait a minute, you're trying to get us to teach a lie. Critical race theory is not the problem. The problem is people who are afraid of the truth, because the truth will make the rising generation act very differently. That's why they're so afraid of it.
Yeah. Well, I just want to say, just for this part of the conversation, I'm just always inspired by the fact that you're out there doing your work with your colleagues, and we work together to do this. So let's go to the questions and answers. I'm so stoked. I don't even remember how this is going to go.
I'm jumping in, and I have to pinch myself at the luck of ParentMap and all of our other partners and the people that got on this call, that we have you two gentlemen here to educate us. So I'm going to start, because I think the level of frustration and concern has to turn to how do we make it easier? This is, and I appreciate the individual parenting side of it, but getting to the institutional side of how do we uplift curriculum at the appropriate age? What are the model school districts? And between the two of you, and I can relate to this in many ways from, we have our Chicago background, Khalil, but Holocaust education, by making it universal in the delivery system, how is the Who We Are Project making it easier to say to somebody who cares deeply to go to their school district and say, here this is wrapped in a golden package. This is the state-of-the-art curriculum. When you say Harvard, whatever it is, help us get there, because we have activists, in our presence.
So here's the thing. There are all kinds of curricula out there. I mean, that's not the problem. A half-hour look, you will be flooded with stuff. And so I'm reluctant to say this one is better than that one. For example, we have cut our film into 6 segments, and we have a study guide. And we were just in front of 1,000 school administrators in California saying, we want to take this and incorporate it into our curriculum. And let me be clear, there are curricula, which means an entire outline of an entire course on a topic. And then there are supplements to that curricula. The Who We Are Project is not going to create a new curricula because there's so many already out there. But what we are doing is creating materials that can assist teachers in teaching this stuff and in getting kids to talk about it. Khalil, what are your thoughts here?
Well, I have 2 thoughts. One, I think you're absolutely right. There's far more available for middle school and high school students in the way of historical curriculum that can be adopted by schools. And in some states, unlike what's been happening recently, 20 years ago, the state of New York and New Jersey passed legislation called the Amistad Commission that empowered the state board of educators to develop curriculum that would essentially center the story of Black history as part of American history and to provide resources for it. One state made it regulatory, one state made it voluntary, and New Jersey has been attempting to make it a requirement rather than voluntary, because you could imagine the heterogeneity of the different communities, you'd see greater uptake and adoption than in other places. The 1619 Project has been working with the Pulitzer Center to adopt some of its controversial history, which frankly is not so much that there aren't differences of perspective that historians have, but I can guarantee you the Pulitzer Center, for its own reputation, will make sure that it avoids controversial subject matter in the translation of that material for wide adoption, just as is true when I use the 1619 Project in my classroom. So Jeff's right about a lot of different sources that exist at the level of middle school and high school. Where I think we are lacking is in preschool and in primary education.
Right.
And my work, called the Bioset Project, is an attempt to address that gap. It's slow going, and I'm going to be perfectly honest with everyone on this call. It's slow going because it is the scariest part of this equation. It is the part where using the 4-year-old child who comes home and says, "Mommy, I felt bad because the teacher said this," and then all hell breaks loose in the classroom, has been the third rail of this issue. But I can also tell you that 20 years ago, the National Association for the Education of Young Children came up with its own commitment to anti-racist education for small children, for young children, for preschool age children, because 20 years ago, they recognized that this was a problem, not because they had a grand theory about America's systemic racism. They recognized it as a problem because teacher after teacher after teacher kept coming to them saying, "I've got kids as young as 4 and 5 years old who are saying really terrible things to each other, and I don't know what to do about it." So I will say we are not as far along in developing that curriculum, and that's what I'm trying to work on.
The last thing I'd like to say is that, especially for middle school and high school, it's important to understand that a classroom is not the only place that people learn. One of the things that Who We Are Project is going to be doing, and that we are fundraising for, is to go into states that have anti-CRT laws. Showing our film in a school in those states would probably be illegal. But there's nothing they can do if we rent an auditorium on a Saturday, and if we hire Black-owned restaurants to feed everyone in that auditorium, and if we bring national and local experts, and not just lecturers, but people from the arts to talk about the national and local history. And if we did it in a place like, I don't know, Florida, and we sent invitations to Governor DeSantis and to all of the members of the state legislature who were behind these anti-woke laws, saying, "Come see what you're afraid of. It's not so scary." This is the kind of thing, and we've had the Who We Are Project has been in contact with the largest teachers union in America. Believe me, I'm not saying every teacher in America is behind us, but a whole lot of them are. They actually want to teach. They want to teach like what actually happened, and they're concerned. So I think one of the things to do is to look for organizations like ours and like the Bioset organization that are going to be helping with what can be done outside the classroom, because the classroom is one place to learn, but it is not the only place.
That's a perfect segue, and you might have answered this question. There's this is happening across the country, thankfully. There's a wonderful Rabbi Jay Rosenbaum in Seattle that works on Black-Jewish relations, and he submitted this question. Seattle, like many cities represented here, are still quite segregated. Blacks and whites don't mix. They don't live in the same neighborhoods. They don't go to the same schools and live in separate worlds. How do we go about changing that?
I mean, I'll take a quick stab at this. It's like putting the cart before the horse. So in my opinion, I'm playing the long game. I've got 25 good years, God willing. And writing legislation to deal with zoning restrictions may work, but it also might be voted down by a new administration locally or at the state level in, who knows, 5-10 years. I mean, no one could have anticipated, and even I'll admit this, no one anticipated the backlash to Barack Obama's presidency. And I had my own criticisms of Barack Obama. So, we went from like okay to really terrible as far as I'm concerned. So the point is that we have to do really big systemic change in terms of how people think about these problems. And so I think the person is right. How do we get folks to live together? Well, one is we're going to have to enforce anti-discrimination law in fair housing. The 1968 fair housing legislation essentially has never been enforceable at scale. And Nixon himself is documented on the record by saying, we're not going to open the suburbs. I don't care what that law just said. George Romney almost lost his job, who was the first HUD secretary, when he decided, as a good-hearted Republican moderate, by today's
Right.
he would have been basically a flaming leftist Democrat. He said, I think we should do this. And Nixon said no. And Reagan made it even worse. So we have gone backwards in terms of what the civil rights movement provided us as tools, which again is why critical race theory in law school is so important. If we could train lawyers to be inventive about the arguments they need to make before our courts, then we could begin to punish malefactors who are systematically upholding the status quo when it comes to discrimination. Mostly, this is a conversation that is about hearts and minds, about the choices individuals make. But if the costs are high for individuals to make the choice to be the pioneers of integration, then we're not going to see change at scale. We've got to redistribute those costs, and mostly the law is going to have to be the mechanism for doing that.
And I can't agree with you more. And I just want to say that in part, this is why simply the history is so important. You talk about the long game, and I'm hoping I've got 10 or 15 left, but who knows? Who knows? But the one thing that I am certain of is that this problem will not be resolved when I am dead and buried in the ground. And I think that all of us as human beings have a tendency to want to run to the solution really quickly. What's the solution? Let's get to that solution. And that's part of the reason that we take 2 steps forward and 3 steps backward, because instead of asking ourselves, okay, we've got a problem here, let's make sure we've diagnosed it correctly and we understand how we actually got here before we start coming up with solutions. It's the quick solutions that haven't worked. And so, Khalil, you say the long game, and that is it. It took 400 years to get to this point. It's going to take a minute to dismantle it, but understanding that it's going to take that minute doesn't mean that it's not possible, and it doesn't mean that advances can't be made. And I will just end this comment by saying, look at what happened on January 6th. And look at how many parents are screaming at school board meetings to keep their children from learning simply the truth. That is desperate behavior. And that is the behavior of people who see that there is an opportunity here for America to go in a direction that we haven't really gone before. And so when I see that desperation, I read The Art of War, and that tells me when your quote unquote opponent starts acting that way, what they're telling you is, we think you're onto something, and we think this could be the start of a change that we really are afraid of.
On that note, I'm going to ask this final question, and I'm kind of blown away by the at least geographic diversity that we have on this call, from Ann Arbor to Oshkosh, Virginia, San Francisco. It's all over. So you, Khalil, referenced Black Jewish, you referenced Asian hate. And I think ultimately, the allyship is so critical in working positively together. And, there's been breakage in these allyships, and I love both of your kind of wisdom in moving communities together, because it sounds trite to say it, but it takes a village. It takes the comprehensive village of humanity to move this forward. We need each other.
Yeah. So I'll say very quickly, I'm going to encourage everyone on this call to read Dr. King's last book. We just celebrated his birthday. And it's a wonderful way to learn about King. If you've never really read one of his books, it's Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. He talks a lot about a minority of white people as allies, but he's even more concerned about a majority of whites who stand on the sidelines in the face of the segregationist attack that he talks about. And that is the problem we have. I could hold up 1,000 examples of Jewish colleagues, of Asian, of Latino, and many, many others who are on the front lines of this work. But as a category of people, they are being maligned daily as the woke mob. And so the choice is less about the particular allies that already exist and more about the people standing on the sidelines, either engaging in performative acts of allyship with a sign in the window and nothing more, or people who are now confused and think there's something to the claim of the Black Lives Matter people being the actual terrorists, that Antifa might have actually been involved in January 6th, or that, I don't really know what to make of this, and so I'm going to lay low. And that is the problem that we face right now. And that includes every group, including Jews and Asians, and Black folks. Trump got 50% more votes from Black people in 2020 than he got in 2016. And let me just tell you, the kabuki dance and minstrelsy that we're about to see play out in the Republican Party, and I'm not being partisan, I know you guys are nonprofit, I'm just saying where it matters to look right now, that's where it's happening most. And it's not that the Democrat doesn't have its own problems with this issue, but you're going to see even more people of color be put front and center as the evidence that none of this has anything to do with race or racism. And that's like saying because there were Black slaveholders, which there were in places like New Orleans back in the 1800s, slavery wasn't about racism. That's how absurd that problem becomes.
And so it is an incredibly important question. And Elaine, I will say this: politics have always been used to separate groups that have been systemically oppressed because they are terrified of what happens if we are together. And I would just say, anyone who is confused about this, please just go back and look at the images from Charlottesville. The Nazi flag and the KKK are walking side by side. I think that tells you all you need to know about where and how deeply our allyship runs and how we have to return to it.
We've got our work cut out for us, guys. Really. And I encourage both of you through your organizations to, constantly be in touch with how we can help amplify the, work that needs to be done. So thank you both. I hope we'll do this again.
Absolutely.
I also hope, on another important subject, our next lecture with the wildly famous and also local Pepper Schwartz, Built to Last: Surprising Secrets for Happy Couples and Partners, on February 7th. And just thank you again. And again, it's the beginning of more work for us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Or to the next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.